For the third year in a row, we hit the top 5 in Fantasy Pros accuracy. Let us help you with your Week 9 starts and sits on the Fantasy First Down. I'm Ben Wasley. Welcome to the Fantasy First Down. And as always, Saturday means our start sit show. If you've got any questions, make sure you leave them in the comments below, or you can message us on Instagram at the Fantasy First Down or on Twitter at Fantasy First Down with no O. If you want our full rankings, you can check out ffdfantasyfootball.com. I'll keep updating those until Sunday's games. And of course, it would be great if you could like and subscribe on YouTube. But let's get straight into it. And as always, we're starting with the quarterbacks. And as always, the colors represent good and bad matchups. Top 9 and bottom 9 matchups for the week based on points allowed according to Fantasy Pros. And we're starting off with Jalen Hurts up top, which is actually against consensus, weirdly. But realistically, if you got Jalen Hurts, you're starting him. If you got Josh Allen, you're starting him. Same thing with Lamar. And realistically, Jaden Daniels is a must start as well. It gets a little bit more interesting below that. Joe Burrow is a tricky one this week because against the Raiders, I don't think they're really going to have to throw very much, but they will surely score enough points to make Burrow a solid option, as opposed to Patrick Mahomes, who I think is probably going to have to throw on the Bucs. We've seen the Bucs have to be able to score plenty of points this season, and even without Mike Evans and Chris Godwin, they still look like a high-scoring offense, meaning I think that Patrick Mahomes is going to have to air it out a little bit more than usual, and that could mean that he actually becomes a viable fantasy option this week. Sam Darnold's in a dissimilar situation that he gets a weak defense that he gets to play against. I feel like this could be another solid week, although he does have a lower ceiling than the guys around him. Kirk Cousins has a very high ceiling, as we've seen against Tampa a couple of times. He takes on Dallas. You can run against Dallas, but you can also pass your wide receivers on them, and I think that that is a path that they could choose to take here, so I think Cousins is a good, solid option. Jordan Love, of course, only in there if he's healthy. He is possibly going to be a game time decision. We might hear something a little bit earlier in the day, but for now, he's very much questionable. So obviously, only start him if he's healthy. And finally, Kyler Murray. That's a tough matchup against Chicago, but we've seen in tough matchups, Kyler does tend to run a little bit more, and they still tend to put up enough touchdowns. You're meant to be able to run on Chicago, but that's kind of been fading as the year's been going on. So I do think that we could still see a solid game for Kyler. Usually he'd be ranked a little bit high, but he's had a couple of tough matchups of late. And just below him, Dak Prescott has had a disappointing season, but we've seen Atlanta end up in a lot of shootouts, and I feel like this could be one of those. Same thing with Bo Nix. When he's been in shootouts, he has managed to score points. And of course, he was very good against Carolina last week as well, but who's not? Against Baltimore, well, they've conceded the most points to opposing quarterbacks, so you would have to feel like he has a good chance this week. Sorry, the third most points against opposing quarterbacks. But in this sort of situation where Baltimore's going to score a heap, will Bo Nix manage to give it back to them, or will it be one of those situations where they just kind of fall into a bundle? I don't know, but that's why I've got Nix a little bit lower than some people are suggesting. Matthew Stafford had a great week last week, but Seattle's not really the greatest passing game matchup. They're okay, but I do feel like there's better options around, especially when the Rams should realistically be able to run the ball against them at times. It's one of those few games we've seen this season where the Rams are actually going in as favorites in what should be a pretty close game. So I don't think that Stafford's someone you can rely on. Same with Geno Smith on the other side. The Rams defense has been improving a little bit. I think Geno's just a good, solid option, but I'd much rather start streamers like Prescott and Nix. Baker Mayfield has been solid most weeks, but against KC, this is the toughest matchup in football for most positions, but not the QB position. Against QBs, they've conceded the 16 most points so far this season. So Mayfield becomes a viable option, but it is easy to see this being a game that's very low scoring with the Chiefs just wanting to try to limit Tampa Bay as much as possible. Jared Goff has had some big weeks when he's been able to score touchdowns, but for the most part, they've just been able to run the ball, and that's why I don't have him high most weeks. He's going to have those good weeks, but Green Bay's best attacked on the ground. I think that's probably what they're going to do. Guys like Caleb Williams, not so much this week. I kind of need to see him do it more consistently. He looked very good going into the bye, but he hasn't since then. So I need to see him start doing it again before I'm going to start him. And of course, guys like Joe Flacco coming in, taking over from Anthony Richardson. It is a very good matchup, but we've got to actually see it keep happening. I can't rank him any higher than that, but he is a viable streamer start if you're absolutely desperate. You notice guys like Tua are a little bit lower. That's a tough matchup against Buffalo. And Jameis Winston looked great last week, but in one of the easiest matchups in football, now he gets the Chargers. Admittedly, the Chargers are without Christian Fulton, but I do still think that Jameis isn't someone I particularly want to be starting this week. Now, running backs. Obviously, starting Saquon, you're starting Derrick Henry. Kyren Williams gets a great matchup against Seattle. He should be solid. Alvin Kamara against Carolina. I mean, again, he's going to be someone that should get a heap of carries. He's going to be very good. Not at all concerned about him, though I am concerned about the fact that I've got his graphic wrong somehow. No idea how that's happened. But yeah, Kamara is someone that you can definitely trust. Bijan Robinson against Dallas. You do tend to run a lot against the Cowboys. The problem is the Falcons are the favorites. If they get an early lead, they do tend to lean on Tyler Algier later on in the game, and that could limit Bijan a little bit. So you kind of want this to be a close game, and I feel like that could happen, but it is entirely possible Bijan doesn't actually get as many carries as he should in what's actually a pretty good matchup. Joe Mixon and Breece Hall we already saw, but Kenneth Walker really disappointing last week. Will he bounce back against the Rams? He's always got such good scoring upside, and I feel like as long as that game stays close, Walker will be heavily involved. James Cook gets a fantastic matchup. I copped a little bit of heat for ranking him too low last week. This week, I'm not making the same mistake. Miami definitely best attacked on the ground. That's partly because they have played with a terrible quarterback for the most part, so teams have been able to run on them because they haven't been chasing points. But I do still think that their run defense is a lot better than their pass defense. Sorry, a lot worse than their pass defense because they've got excellent cornerbacks. Now, Aaron Jones has been getting a lot of carries. I believe Ty Chandler got like 2 snaps last week. It was all Aaron Jones, and that could easily happen this week against Indy, but he's ranked a little bit lower than some because I do think it's entirely possible if they get a bit of a lead, they will start to lean on Chandler or even Cam Akers later on in the game. Jahmyr Gibbs still well ahead of David Montgomery. Gibbs gets more touches, especially later into the game, even though they use Montgomery early. Both have really good scoring upside, but the Packers defense is actually sneaky pretty good. So while you can run on them, I don't know that they're going to score a heap of points, so I can't rank them too high when they're splitting touches. Same thing with Achane and Mostert, but they get a far better matchup against Buffalo, and for that reason, I'm a lot more comfortable in starting them. The problem is Achane hasn't been getting as high a proportion of touches. Mostert's been getting a lot of the goal line work, but if he doesn't get goal line work, he's not getting catches. He's still very risky. They will use a little bit of Jalen Wright if they get a lead or if they fall behind a long way. There's enough risk in both of those guys that are not willing to put them higher. This is probably the lowest you'll see Jonathan Taylor. He's still coming back from injury a little bit. Plus, they take on the Vikings, who have an excellent run defense. The Vikings have conceded the 9th fewest points to running backs so far this season. As long as the Colts are in the game, I do think you'll still see some Taylor, but I don't think they're going to rely on him like they do some weeks. Swift, very good matchup against Cardinals like him this week. Chase Brown against Vegas. This is a solid running back matchup. They've conceded the 10th most points against running backs. The Raiders, so just missing out on the green. But Chase Brown is going to be the lead running back this week. There is no Zach Moss. He's doubtful. Well, there's presumably no Zach Moss because he's doubtful. That means Travion Williams will back him up. He'll presumably only get like the 2-minute drill stuff and anything that actually, or third downs or anything that really requires proper pass blocking. If they want the running back out running a route, they're happy to use Chase Brown. But if they want him blocking, I think they'd rather use Williams. And for that reason, I can't have Brown any higher. But I do think he's going to have a busy game and he's someone we can rely on. As opposed to James Conner, who could easily end up behind against the Bears. And then all of a sudden you get in an ugly situation. So while I think he could be solid, I don't feel great about him. Same thing with Hunt. Just not sure how the touches are going to go there. Tony Pollard, hoping he's healthy. If he was fully healthy, I'd have him higher than that. But I think given he's a little bit banged up and might not even play, Julius Chestnut is a guy who's going to get some touches. In fact, if Pollard is out, I think Chestnut's probably someone that you can bring in and use as a really good streamer. I'll probably have Chestnut around 24, 25 region. If Pollard's out, kind of just behind Chuba Hubbard ahead of Ramondre Stevenson, because realistically, he is going to be the lead guy, and you can definitely run on the Patriots. Josh Jacobs, very tough matchup against Detroit. You do not want to run on the Lions. 3rd fewest points conceded against running backs. Brian Robinson Jr. coming back from injury, not getting the touches that he should be getting, still using a lot of Eckler. If that game gets out of hand for either team, you're all of a sudden going to see a lot of McNichols as well. So hard to trust Robinson, but he does have touchdown upside. Dobbins, you don't want to run against the Browns, but he is still the lead guy. He's just not looking as good as he was earlier in the season when he was breaking off those big runs. But I think that's been partly matchup, partly O-line. Tyrone Tracy looks like he's going to play. He's recovered quickly from that concussion. That's great. Solid matchup against Washington, but realistically, you're still going to see a little bit of Singletary. Hasn't practiced much this week, so we don't know if he can take the full load. That'll be an interesting one. Chuba Hubbard against the Saints. Not actually a great running back matchup. It's just the Saints have had a terrible quarterback at times, and therefore teams have been able to run on them in games where the Saints can't score. But that's not likely to be the case this week. I feel like the Saints with Derek Carr back will be a lot better on offense. That's going to hurt Carolina, mean they have to pass the ball a little bit more. I think you'll see a little bit less Chuba, but he might get some checkdowns to make it work. In PPR, he's a bit higher for me. Ramondre Stevenson, 2 touchdowns last week, but Tennessee, not the greatest of matchups, even though there is a chance that they'll at least be in the game, the Patriots. You can definitely run on the Titans because you can't throw on them. I just don't know that they're going to be able to move the ball at all. It just feels like one of those games where it's going to be very hard for either team to get anything going because they've both got terrible quarterback play. Hopefully Drake May's at least back for the Patriots. That would help Stevenson a little bit. Nick Chubb, tough matchup against the Chargers. I do expect he'll get more carries this week, but he's not getting a lot of passing down work. He's getting a little bit, but they're not passing it to him when they're doing it. It's really hard to trust anyone running against the Chargers or in general playing against the Chargers. They've just conceded so few points. They've conceded the second fewest points to running backs and the third fewest points to wide receivers. So it's just hard against this Chargers defense, partly because they've played some really weak teams, but also partly because they're actually playing legitimately well. Alexander Madison's clearly taken over that role, but when they're behind the Raiders, he can't get anything going. He was rushing for like barely over a yard a carry last week. They still like him better than Zamir White, and I'm not going to say rightly so because I think Zamir White's probably a better running back in certain situations, but Madison has more of an all-round skill set. Wouldn't be surprised if we see some Amir Abdullah once they fall behind, especially in those 2-minute drills. He's just very risky. I might move Mostert above him, honestly. All the Tampa Bay guys, Rashad White's top for me, but they're taking on KC, and it's so hard to move the ball in KC. They've conceded the fewest points against running backs because you're always behind against KC. It's really hard to run the ball on them. They've got such a strong D-line, and they've got a strong enough secondary that they can just kind of cover everywhere. And that means that it's going to be White with some checkdowns, but realistically, White's going to struggle. Irving's a little bit injured. He's going to struggle. We're going to play through it probably. And then Sean Tucker will be a little bit involved as well. So hard to trust any of those guys. Rico Dowdle, usually I like, but Atlanta is not the easiest matchup this week. They are very good against running backs. 9th fewest points conceded against running backs this season. So hard to trust Dowdle, but he is the main guy. I think we saw how bad they were with Zeke and Dalvin Cook last week. Surely it's going to be Dalvin getting the load this week. I like him better than the other risky guys. Guys like the Jags who are playing against Philly. You don't want to run against Philly either. They've got that really strong D-line, conceded the 5th fewest points against running backs this season. You just can't run on them. Etienne, I think, probably takes over the main role, but I'm not confident in that. Bigsby, if they fall behind, will hardly get used. We saw that in that game where Dearness Johnson got involved heavily in week 7, so maybe week 6. So it's very hard to trust Bigsby. Can't trust Etienne, can't trust any of them. Javonte Williams and Jaleel McLaughlin, you can't trust them against the Ravens because you cannot run on the Ravens. Firstly, because you'll generally be behind. And secondly, because they've got a very good run defense. And lastly, because you can pass on them so easily, the teams usually just pass. So I guess you're just really hoping for a touchdown from Javonte Williams, if anything. Tyler Algier, I talked about earlier. He does get used a lot in wins. If they can get a bit of a lead, Algier will actually score some points. And he's the last of the guys I'm willing to really start this week. Everyone else is a little bit risky. Miles Sanders in PPR, maybe a little bit of upside there. Roshan Johnson has some touchdown upside in like a non-PPR. You can consider him. Julius Chestnut, I mentioned earlier, as a positive option as well. Wide receivers, and Lamb, you're starting. He blew up last week. He was excellent. Justin Jefferson, week to week, you're starting him every week. Jamar Chase with no T. Higgins. You've got to start him even though it's a tough matchup against the Raiders because you just don't need to throw on them. But they're going to have to throw to somebody at some stage. So it's going to be Chase, a little bit of Gesicki. Joseph will be involved in the red zone. You might see a little bit more Jermaine Burton. He emerged a little bit last week. I wouldn't be surprised if you see a bit more of him. In a really deep dynasty league, he's worth picking up if someone hasn't already. But other than that, I mean, I think Chase is going to be the only Bengal along with Burrow that I feel particularly good about starting this week, although Chase Brown's interesting and Gesicki will be okay. AJ Brown gets that really good matchup. Considered putting him ahead of Chase, and maybe I still will. Tyreek Hill, tough matchup against Buffalo, but I don't know. Tyreek Hill just always makes it work with Tua. So I do feel okay about starting Tyreek with Tua. He still has very high scoring upside. It's not like Buffalo's defense is perfect. They've conceded the 5th fewest points against wide receivers, but you can definitely score on them. Amon-Ra St. Brown against the Packers. It's a tough slot matchup against the Packers. So for that reason, I don't feel great about him, but I'm still willing to start him. He is still the main guy. You just can't sit St. Brown. Malik Neighbors looked great last week before the injury, but it looks like he's going to be back. Gets a good matchup against Washington, but it's not the matchup it used to be. This is still going to be a situation where he's got some upside, will probably get a lot of targets. Will he be able to do enough with it? Well, for me, enough that you should be starting him. Puka Nacua, re-injured the knee, but it looks like it's not a major issue. Hopefully he plays. If he does, he's a top 10 option for me against Seattle because you definitely want that outside guy against Seattle. If not, Cooper Kupp rises a little bit, but not a lot because you don't really want slot guys against Seattle, but he's still going to be a solid start. Drake London against Dallas, not the best matchup, but still a solid matchup. You can run so well on Dallas that teams don't usually pass, but Drake London just seems to have so much fortune in the red zone. I feel like this is a situation where you want the outside guys against Dallas, and that means London and Mooney, and that's why I've got them ranked rather high. And Chris Olave, I've got ranked higher than I think anybody else. Certainly any of the other top rankers on Fantasy Pros. I kind of look at the top 20 guys and see what they're doing just to make sure I'm not way off consensus. But in this case, I am, and I don't care. I'm staying high on Chris Olave. I really think that he has high scoring upside against Carolina. They've really just got him, Alvin Kamara, and a pile of tight ends, and that's about it. So realistically, they're going to have to use him a little bit. It's not like Carolina's so bad you can just run on them all day. I do think you'll see Olave have some chances to score points. I wouldn't be surprised if he has a touchdown or two and might get some solid yardage as well. Plenty of good matchups here. We obviously saw Garrett Wilson and Devontae Adams already go off, had them ranked pretty high. Terry McLaurin gets a great matchup against the Giants. I tossed up moving him higher as well. Cooper Kupp, not a great matchup against Seattle, but he's still someone you kind of have to start. He versus, for example, Devontae Smith's a tough one. I think Smith has a little bit more upside, but when you're the wide receiver too, even if it's a great matchup, there is always some risk, and for that reason, I got him a little bit lower. Jaden Reed, I don't feel great about, even though he's got by far the best slot matchup in football. The Lions just funnel everything into the middle of the field, into their pass game. Their O-line's good. D-line's good. They can stop the run, and their outside coverage is okay, but gosh, slot receivers go off against them. So I do think Reed should be good, but he's not only getting 11 personnel, and he's not been productive the last 3 weeks. I think he's got 70-odd yards the last 3 weeks combined. Hard to feel great about him, but he is someone you still got to start. Marvin Harrison, a little bit lower because he gets that tough Chicago matchup that they are weaker outside than they are to the slot. So that makes Harrison an okay start. Josh Downs and Michael Pittman both in there get that excellent matchup against the Vikings. The Vikings are so bad against wide receivers. They've conceded the most points by a margin against wide receivers. They've conceded 5 more points per game than the 4th worst matchup, which is Jacksonville, which we still talk about as being a great matchup. You can throw on the Vikings all day, and teams do this all the time. Remember Matthew Stafford against the Vikings was at like 4 touchdowns, all the wide receivers. So look, expect this to be a good game for Downs and Pittman. Pittman a little bit more risky because he's not necessarily healthy. So it's hard to know how he's going to react. And there's always a chance he just stops halfway through the game. But Downs, really high upside here, could have a big game. Brian Thomas, injured a little bit, but I still like his situation, especially with Christian Kirk out. You'd have to feel like Thomas is the main guy. Even Gabe Davis is a little bit banged up. If they all sit, I have no idea what to do with this offense. Parker Washington will be the main guy. You'll see a little bit of Tim Jones, but I don't know. I think it's going to be Evan Ingram and the running backs in that case, like we saw with the Bucks. And that makes me disinterested in the lower wide receivers in any situation. Whereas if Thomas plays, really like him in this situation. Solid matchup as an outside receiver against Philly. I feel like he's going to be the main guy. He's got really high scoring upside. I'd definitely start him. Talked about Mooney earlier. Not the greatest matchup, but he's the wide receiver 12 on the season, so you certainly got to start him. Courtland Sutton, I've got higher than I think anyone else I could find, certainly in those more accurate rankers. Baltimore, such a good matchup for wide receivers. He is their main guy. They're just cycling the other guys. No one's getting more than about 60% snaps on a weekly basis. If you're going to start anyone from Denver, it has to be Sutton. Can't be anybody else. He's the only one of interest in this matchup besides Bo Nix. So for that reason, Sutton is a good, solid start for me. Tank Dell, relatively high on him this week as he plays, even though he's playing against the Jets, because I think he's going to get a lot of targets. And look, he did. He ended up being very good. So kind of happy with that ranking there. DJ Moore, I've got pretty low despite the good matchup. He's just been bad for weeks, and I need to see it before I'm willing to put him back higher. Say Flowers a little bit lower because it's a really tough matchup, and also Deontay Johnson coming out. I don't think we're going to see a lot of Johnson this week, but I think we'll see enough to be inconvenient. Calvin Ridley rising up a little bit, but against New England, you can just run all day. You don't really need to pass, and so I don't think we're going to see a lot of targets. We'll have them lean on him. I think we'll also see guys like Nick Westbrook-Akine in the red zone. You'll see a little bit of the tight ends, but it's just going to be a whole lot of running backs. I think it's going to be a very low-scoring, low-yardage game. Ladd McConkey was very good last week, but he was a little bit fluky, a little bit lucky. Gets a solid matchup this week. Oddly enough, we don't really think of Cleveland as being a good passing matchup, but they've conceded the 5th most points against wide receivers, which is really weird, given they've still got plenty of quality in their cornerbacks. They're just not playing well. So Ladd McConkey, a solid option. They're not as good against the slot as they are out wide, Cleveland, as a matchup. So for that reason, McConkey's not a great option, but he's solid. So I would happily start McConkey this week. Jacoby Myers, the main guy in Vegas, gets a solid matchup. Waddle, terrible matchup against the Bills. We really need to see it from Waddle before we can start trusting him again. The whole thing with the Bills game in general is going to be really weird. You can't trust any of the wide receivers in this game because it's tough matchups on both sides, but both teams can run. So that could speed this game up a lot, and we could end up seeing a really quick game because there's so much running, and therefore the ball's not out of play often. Amari Cooper, will he bounce back this week? They look like they wanted to use him a lot in the first week, and then the second week they just kind of didn't. I feel like he's always got upside, so I can't move him lower than that because you're going to regret it if he has a big game. Kind of the same thing with Khalil Shakir, has some big games there. You kind of can target a little bit Miami from the slot. Using the slot versus wide analysis tool on Raswell, which I use for all of my ranking. Miami, really difficult to attack from out wide or from the slot. They're just good against both. So don't feel great against either of these guys, but I still think Shakir always has some point upside. Xavier Worthy, I just don't trust him. Those touchdowns are really wallpapering over what has been pretty disappointing performance so far this season. I think if he didn't have those 5 touchdowns and only had 1 or 2, we'd be thinking of him as a total bust. Romeo Dobbs, I talk about this every week, gets a great matchup. He's getting so many touches at the moment. The only thing that gives me pause is that Christian Watson seems to have more clearly taken over that third wide receiver role, and that will hurt Dobbs because Watson is a very good player and arguably a better player than Wicks is, which is probably why he's finally gotten that role. JSN and Tyler Lockett against the Rams. You do not want to be a slot receiver against the Rams. They are the toughest matchup against the Rams, again, according to Rasbel. So I would prefer Lockett. The problem is Lockett's not getting as many targets in general. So I'm kind of taking them from a long way apart and bringing them in very tight now. But I'm not willing to put Lockett quite ahead yet. Cedric Tillman, I started him in so many leagues last week. I've talked about him in the other videos. Normally he's going to be a great start, but this week against the Chargers, I don't trust outside receivers against the Chargers. I don't trust receivers in general against the Chargers. I don't want my players playing against the Chargers at the moment just because they're running out games and slowing them down a lot, and their defense is pretty darn solid. So Tillman could have another solid game, but it's hard to trust him. It's hard to trust Judy. It's hard to trust Moore. But when they've had such a big game last week, you can't sit them ahead of guys who are total lotteries. Keenan Allen has also been really disappointing, as has Rome Odunze. Allen kind of came back with a couple of touchdowns 2 weeks ago, but has done nothing since then. So he and Odunze are guys I just don't particularly want to touch. DeAndre Hopkins, a lot of people are very high on him. He had like 20 snaps last week, and he wasn't even running routes in all of those. I don't think you can trust him. You need to see it happen first. We saw with Tennessee, he was only out there like 40% of the time. Do you really want to trust him this week in a situation where we don't know how this game's going to look? We don't know how he's going to be used. I don't like it at all. He's clearly at best the number 3 option in this offense, and that's at best. We're still seeing some Noah Gray. You'll see a lot of Kareem Hunt. I don't want this. I don't like this situation. I'm starting him if I'm desperate. Same thing with guys like Addison, Keon Coleman. I talked about the Bills situation already. Christian Watson's an interesting one. The reason I don't have him higher is because he and Wicks have bounced back and forth with their usage all season. We saw earlier in the season, at the start of the season, it was all Watson. He was getting about 60 to 70% of the touches. Then suddenly he got injured. Wicks got involved. Watson came back. We saw a little bit of Watson. Then it went back to Wicks, and they switched roles, but still went 50-50. Then last week, out of nowhere, Watson played the most snaps he has all season as a percentage and was playing ahead of Reed, for example. He was like the number 2 receiver. It's hard to trust that happening again this week, though. It's hard to tell if they're doing something matchup related, if they're just basing it on what they see in practice or what happened the last week. I don't know. But this should be a very good matchup. It's just hard to trust him. Guys who also have good matchups, Xavier Legette should have a good matchup against the Saints, but I don't trust it. I don't trust that Carolina offense with with Bryce Young. Getting my Youngs mixed up. With Bryce Young, just don't trust him at all. If this was Dalton, I'd feel okay about it. I'd have him a couple of spots higher, but I just don't like it at all in this situation. And a whole heap of guys who are very much streamer options with terrible matchups down the bottom. Finally, tight end, Travis Kelce, bounce back. Love him, man. Travis Kelce is my favorite player since I started doing fantasy, basically. Glad to see him doing well. Brock Bowers, he was my favorite player in the offseason. I had Brock Bowers my number 2 in Dynasty. He'll be my number 1 from now on. Look, 2 great matchups, 2 great players. Really looking forward to how those two both go. I've got so many of both of them in my fantasy team. So happy with how tight end's going, even though my weekly tight end ranking has been my weakness this year. David Njoku, another good matchup. I talked about Njoku a heap. He was my favorite stash for weeks while he was injured, and he comes back and he's looking really good. Kate Otten, another one that I called, so happy with that. Great matchup against KC. KC have conceded the second most points to tight ends after Carolina, and it's pretty close. This is a great matchup. He is a solid option, has far more scoring upside as does Njoku than McBride. In PPR, I probably have McBride higher than both of them, but in half PPR, you're relying on targets, and they're not worth as much in half PPR. McBride has not scored all season. This is not the greatest matchup for him. Same thing with Evan Ingram. Very tough matchup for him. Those guys will both get their targets. They'll both be sold. They get their yardage, but they lack the upside because of the lack of touchdowns. Kyle Pitts has been a bit in and out. Against Dallas, I think he has good scoring upside, but it's also possible he does absolutely nothing, and that makes him very risky. And then we hit the cliff. Jake Ferguson should be a good, solid option, but he hasn't been good since he came back from injury. Can he bounce back against Atlanta? I feel like he always has scoring upside, but he's not getting the touches. They're just going to lamb all day. Sam Laporta was really disappointing. He was looking like the bust of the season, then all of a sudden came out and had a touchdown and could have had 2. Will he continue on with that, or will he go back to doing nothing now that it's no longer National Tight End Day? Look, if Brock Wright would stop stealing his touchdowns, that would be really good. But realistically, Laporta is someone who's risky, but so is every other tight end below this. Dalton Kincaid, tough matchup, is getting used a little bit, but with Amari Cooper coming in, you have to feel like Kincaid will fade just a little bit. Tucker Kraft gets a tough matchup, but you can still score through the air against Detroit. As a tight end, it's usually pretty bad, but he plays more of a slot receiver, wide receiver role a lot of the time. And when that happens, he's going to get targets. So it's one of those weird things where he's red, but it's actually not that bad a situation because of the type of role he plays. Always has scoring upside. I feel okay about him this week. TJ Hawkinson, first week back. Don't really trust players first week back, even though it's a good matchup. Do they give him a welcome back touchdown gift? I really hope so. But I do think it's also possible he scores you like 1 or 2 points. So that's why I can't have him any higher than that. Mark Andrews, also a big risk. We've seen that Andrews and Likely hardly get used when they're winning. They're just kind of in there to block. And so for that reason, I can't trust Andrews in a game where they're heavy favorites. I believe, according to Vegas, just looking at my data now, 8-point favorite. That's a lot. Then again, they were last week against the Browns as well, and you ended up with a lot of Andrews because the Browns ended up being better than we expected. So that's kind of what you got to hope for if you're an Andrews owner. You got to hope that the game stays close, and they need to use Andrews in the passing game. Ertz and Henry, tough matchups, but they've been pretty good at times this season, so I feel okay about them. Cole Kmet was the top 3 tight end for a lot of this season. He's just so inconsistent and hasn't been used. The Bears in general have been inconsistent and poor at times, especially with Keenan Allen back. You can't trust Kmet. Taysom Hill returns. Will we see more of him now that we've got no Jamal Williams and no Kendre Miller, I believe, this week? Obviously, Jordan Mims will be involved, but I feel like Taysom Hill might take over at that second running back role. If we hear any sniff of that at all, I will move him up a little bit as well. Mike Gesicki gets used a little bit better when they play without T. Higgins, but he gets used worse when they're winning. So I don't know how that's going to end up kind of like evening out this week. I feel like he's probably still a solid option to have. That moves him well ahead of Eric All because of that usage without Higgins, but he's not going to be a fantastic option this week, I don't think. Guys like Smith, Likely, just so boom bust. Calcaterra was actually pretty good last week. It didn't seem like it, but he actually had a solid game. Juwan Johnson, I think, is a sneaky one that you could use. There is no Noah Fant this week. I think Barner's going to be the main beneficiary, but it's hard to trust him or really any of these guys that are lower below like a Gesicki. You just got so little upside and so much risk that I don't love any of them. And that's all we've got for our start sit show for week 9. Hope you enjoyed it. Hope that helped you out. If you got questions, hit me up in the comments on Instagram at the Fantasy First Down, on Twitter at Fantasy First Down with no O, and you can check out my updated rankings at ffdfantasyfootball.com. It'd be great if you can like and subscribe, and I will see you next week for Week 10 of Fantasy Football.